been well, apart from poor Father Roy. I'm so glad they found out what it was.
Yes.
Because I talked to him on the telephone, he said, you know, had all these tests.
And it's something fairly common.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the candy.
I was surprised they didn't pick it up.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That'd be one of the first things they test for.
I think
Yeah.
so. He said they
And
did heart and lungs and everything.
Yes. Well, of course, since he had the COVID,
That's right, I guess.
I thought maybe it was just a residual kind. So many people are having residual problems.
He's had a difficult year with COVID. He's had a difficult year, what with the COVID and now this.
Yeah.
And the fires out west and everything else.
That's right, it is.
Yeah.
Neck of the woods.
Yeah.
It's,
Presumably this is coming.
Yes. I think she was just putting off a couple of layers before sitting back down.
That's right.
Although layers is not the worst idea today.
No, it suddenly got cool. I was out last night with friends, and when I went, it was quite sort of balmy. And when we came out in the building, that wind
Yeah. Wind.
coming from the northeast, northwest. It was
Yeah. Yes.
but tomorrow's going to warm up again. Isn't it?
Oh, good.
well, that's what they said originally. But this morning it was all much lower, and I thought, what do they know?
Yeah. I'm turned on.
I'm on. You're on.
So do I just start?
You are welcome to start. Once again, I failed to print out your bio and introduce you
That's
properly.
right. That's right. I mean,
Warm welcome back.
You should know me by now. So welcome and welcome to those on the live stream. Is that camera straight, by the way, Elise? It looks slightly.
Probably not.
There you go, I'll check it. Thank you.
Last time we met, 2 weeks ago, we were talking about music and the sort of Anglican music, the sort of church history and the history of music. And it's always interesting because we often think it's always been like it is, but of course it wasn't so. I mean, we talked about hymnody, which is so much part of our service. We have 5 hymns, really, today. And hymns are very much a sort of a 19th century, not invention, but development. Late 18th century, 19th century, all the popular hymns, the hymn book came into being, and as I said, in the Episcopal Church, not till the 1880s. So it hasn't always been just as it is now. And partly that was because of the Reformation period. The English Church was affected by Calvinism. It wasn't strictly Calvinistic, but in the Calvinistic Reformation, that is the Swiss Reformation, which had a much wider effect, of course, music was looked down on as being distracting, taking us away from God rather than bringing us nearer to God. And so the only sort of acceptable music was the metrical psalm. And really the metrical psalm became the sort of basic, what was sung in church, very plain tune, simple tune. And really American church music began with that. It was transplanted because the church here developed just after the English Reformation and very much affected by the sort of Puritans and their suspicion of music, because music excited the senses, and that was thought not to be a good thing. No dancing, no singing, nothing too emotive. So, so we get what we've got today, partly also because in the English church tradition, of which we are heirs in the Episcopal Church, is the place of the choir and the sung setting for the communion service, Eucharist, in England, there was a sort of another stream of music outside the parish, and that was the royal chapels and the university colleges and the cathedrals. And really, those three organisations together maintained a sort of a more traditional mode of church and music, which we inherit today, and we often call it the English cathedral tradition. And perhaps the best hangover of that, with which we are familiar, is the evensong, evensong sung by a choir and a congregation sitting there and sort of participating by listening largely. Not many of them left. I mean, I grew up in a church where evensong was the biggest service of the day when I was a boy. I sang in the choir and people used to crowd in for evensong. That was in the days before television. It dates me a bit. Well, television didn't come to Australia until 1956, the Olympic Games. But anyhow, we all went to evensong, and that was the big sung service. We sang the psalms, the canticles, and the responses. And that was all provided for in the Book of Common Prayer. So that was very Anglican to sing evensong. And we also sang a communion service once a month. And then other Sundays we sang morning prayer. So we did a lot of singing, and it was all very Anglican. But today we're really concentrating, because of most parishes, the main sung service would be the Sunday Eucharist, like we've just experienced. But I said that the principle in the Book of Common Prayer, with all the service, it says when so-and-so is said or sung. So said or sung was assumed that in certain places you'd say it, and other places you'd sing it. So the principles there are which to build upon. But I want to think about some more fundamental issues today, and particularly about some of the basic principles with regard to music and worship, music and liturgy. Liturgy meaning the service of the church. We've just experienced the liturgy of the Eucharist. So how does music fit in with a typical service like the Eucharist? Well, I said the first thing is music is to be supportive of the liturgy, to enhance the words and the ritual. And later on I say music should not distract or trivialise. So music is to reflect what's going on. So just think about today, a good example, because the hymns are well chosen. They all fitted in nicely. There was a lovely communion anthem, Like as the Heart Desire of the Waterbrooks. It was devotional. If you had a loud anthem there, it would be distracting, wouldn't it? You just receive communion, you want to sort of feel devotional, and the anthem reflected the devotion. And also the prelude and the postlude on the organ, they were they were atmospheric. They sort of somehow fitted in with what the work we were about in the Eucharist. And so music is very important because it creates, as I say, music is to contribute to a sense of beauty and mystery in worship. We often talk about the importance of engaging the senses in church. What we see, how we decorate the communion table, the candles and the hangings and the vestments of the priest, and visually, and what we hear is important, as well as what we say. For the Puritans, of course, what was said was so important, because it was said what was the mind and with the mouth, what was said. But there's more to it than that. We need to engage our whole bodies in worship. And that's why as Episcopalians, we use our bodies in worship. We don't just sit there, we stand, we sit. Occasionally we kneel and we bow and we do, we use our bodies to express something about what we're doing. And so the engagement of the whole person, of all the senses in worship is an important principle. But with music particularly, we're trying to create a sense of beauty, a sense of mystery. And sometimes people say, well, with all the reforms in the church, we lost the sense of mystery. Well, there's truth in that, but mystery can be created by how we use music. You know, I can remember once being in Mont Saint-Michel, off Normandy in France, and my brother and I just wandered into the Abbey Church. Big sort of space. It was a sunny day and the sun was sort of coming in. It was very beautiful. But they were just about to start a mass. And I said to my brother, well, we stayed. He said, yes, let's. And we sat down, and you know the first thing that happened? A nun played a flute solo. Wow. You know, with the sun streaming in the windows and in this great sort of Gothic space, big space like this, much bigger in fact, and just this flute solo was just, it created such a fabulous atmosphere. Very simple, but absolutely, you had to stay because you knew something special was about to happen. So it doesn't have to be a grand organ or whatever. This flute solo did it for us, and we stayed, and it was a beautiful Eucharist. And in fact, although it was a Roman Catholic church, the priest when it came to communion, he didn't just say the words, and he said, come on, like he did this gesture. He had a big basket of the Eucharistic bread, and you couldn't resist. And so we all came up and received. There were about all these tourists there, about 200 or 300 tourists, and a few regulars, and we all came up and got communion. But the atmosphere was just very special, and looking back on it, was very simple how it was created. I have to say, one of the ways they did create, they used incense very cleverly, and because it was a very big church, and the sun was coming in from clear windows, rather like your windows have become, across the church, and the incense was going up through the sunlight. Oh, it was so beautiful. So the sense of beauty and mystery in worship, the music can contribute to that in very important ways. And then I said music like hymns and anthems promote good theology and contribute to the devotional atmosphere. If you have a hymn in the wrong place, it could be jarring, The opening hymn today was Immortal. It was just right. It's a good starter. It says something. We're here about God, and we're here to worship God. It's clear. But if you had that sort of perhaps during communion, it mightn't work so well as a communion hymn. It'd be in the wrong place. You'd feel it would jar. And so the music needs to be sensitively chosen to sort of match what's going on in the service. So, but also it's very important the words are well chosen. We have hymn books, authorised hymn books, because the words have been carefully looked at, and in some cases been changed a little bit, so they sort of reflect what we believe. So the theology of the text is very important indeed. There was a question, I think you asked the question last week about popular music. And I think partly that's to do with context. I mean, if obviously you have a youth service, you'd have different music from what we have today. But nevertheless, the text of the words is very important, because it's a Christian service and we're worshipping God. So, the choice of the music or the song nevertheless needs to be carefully made. It's not. I don't want to say anything about. I'm not talking about style. Which sort of music is right and which is wrong. But as long as it serves the work of what we're doing. And most importantly, I think music helps create community. There's nothing like a good hymn sung by a congregation, it can bring a congregation together, you know. So it brings about community and the unity of the church. And I think looking back, I think sometimes I had one woman who was notorious, but she always managed to say, oh, she sang the wrong tune. Or I didn't like that hymn, but you know, it didn't help her. But normally, if we know the words and we know, or more or less, or we know the tunes, and we sing together with good leadership from organ or whatever the instruments are and choir, it can make a huge difference. And it can help us be united. And the same with the Eucharistic music. If, for instance, you sing the Gloria, you have a setting which everyone knows in the parish, it does give a terrific lift. I mean, I think sometimes diocesan ordinations, we sing some of the popular communion music, which is from the prayer book, like the Schubert setting. And it's with 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 people singing it together, great sense of unity. So that's good to think about, that music serves and aids a sense of unity and community. But also, in the liturgical reforms in the 1979 prayer book particularly, one of the objects of the reformers of the liturgy was to bring about more congregational participation. Those who with longer memories, the old services were much more priest-centred. I mean, growing up in church, we said very few prayers. You sat there and you listened, and the priest said the prayers, except for the Lord's Prayer was a big exception, and the Gloria. But everything else was really, the Creed, but they were all said. But there was much less congregational participation. And a great way to help people participate is to sing things together. So music can really help us participate in what's going on. And I often say, organising funeral things, it's very important to have a well-known hymn at a funeral so everyone can sing. And you know, at a funeral, it often helps you sort of emote a bit. If you sing, you know, Amazing Grace or The Lord is My Shepherd, it can be a very moving thing and helps you perhaps shed a few tears and just sort of feel part of the service. So music can play very important roles in the liturgy. And I said that the music should be appropriate and reflect the context. And context is very important. I mean, if you're in a church like this, or a cathedral, but it's very different if you're in a chapel, just 4 or 5 people. It's different if you're in at a conference centre, or perhaps outdoors with a youth group. The choice of music, obviously, is not the same in each. I mean, you can use similar music, but you need to think about where you're doing it and what forces you have. So I think music always ought to be appropriate to the context in which you meet. And obviously the context of the occasion is very important. It's very different if you're at a wedding or a funeral or a celebration or a time of crisis. How you organise the music then is affected by the occasion. So music needs to be appropriate to and reflect the context of a particular liturgy. And I think music should reflect the Christian tradition, both theological and aesthetic. I've talked a little bit about that music will reflect the theology. Sometimes, you know, I used to, when I was a bishop in Australia, I had quite a few charismatic parishes, charismatic evangelical parishes. And they used a lot of popular music, but very repetitive. And sometimes the words used to jar a bit with me. I said, do you really mean what you say? You know, what you sing is important because it's popular theology. That's why music, hymns are so powerful. It's, for many people, it's sort of pretty basic theology. People often know the hymns better than the Bible. So they are important. And then I go on to a section on which music. Well, obviously hymns for Episcopalians are very important, and we all love our hymns. The Episcopal Church provides several resources. The hymnal of 1983, we're familiar with that. Do you use Let Every Voice Sing hymn? It's a black hymnal. That was brought out some years ago. That's an important group of hymns and songs. And then there's various supplements which have been produced for the hymnal. There's 2 supplements, I think. More contemporary music, a wider variety. So there's always more music to be had. There's a lot out there, and the committees and things that choose these hymnals try and get the best, both in words and tunes, and that can really help us in our worship. So there's a wide variety, but then beyond that, there are lots of hymnals. I mean, I talked about the English hymnal last week, the English hymnal, hymns ancient and modern. The Australian Church has hymn book, the Canadian Church. There are a lot of hymn books around, Methodist hymn book, which often have hymns or tunes that perhaps are not used in the Episcopal Church so much, but if they're well taught, and they can be brought into the use of the Episcopal Church, as there is occasion for it. So there's huge resources out there. And I talk once more about traditionally we have an entrance hymn, a gradual hymn, an offertory hymn, a communion hymn, and or a post-communion hymn. And each one has a special place. And I said, like today was a good example. We started with Immortal, Invisible, God Only Wise. It sort of put down the benchmark. That's what we're here for. We're here to worship God Almighty. We've gathered for worship. So the hymn reminded us of what we're doing. And the last hymn, again, we sort of turned our praise to God. It was a nice way to finish. Although the last hymn can often be more sort of mission-oriented, and sort of sending us out into the world. Forth in thy name, O Lord, we go, thy daily labour to pursue. It's a hymn that sort of sends us out. We go out. The gradual hymn, the hymn just before the gospel, often reflects the readings of the day. If there's a particular theme, or it picks up something in the gospel, or perhaps in the second reading, that gradual hymn can be just perhaps help the service thematically. I mentioned about communion hymns are often devotional, Eucharistic devotional hymns, or personal devotion. So the selection of hymns is important in how they're placed. And I know in my own ministry over the years I've worked with directors of music, and we've often sat for an hour or so looking at the hymns for a month and thinking about them carefully, about how they fit in. Do they reflect the readings? Do they, particularly, do they pick up the season? Seasonal hymns. You don't expect to sing When I Survey the Wondrous Cross on Easter Day, do you? You'd be shocked if you did. You'd complain. So that's sung on Good Friday. But on Easter Day you sing Jesus Christ is risen today. And if I go to church on Easter Day and don't sing it, I get cross. It's one of those things I think goes with Easter. You have your favourites. And the same with Christmas. You expect to sing Hark the Herald Angels Sing. If you don't, you think, well... I remember my eldest brother once came home from a midnight mass at his local parish and was very annoyed because they had a new curate who was a bit of a musician and was a composer. And he had all his own hymns, which no one could sing. And they didn't sing any of the standard sort of Christmas hymns. And he was very, very annoyed. And I always thought at the time, yes, there's a time and a place for the new hymn, maybe one in the service, but not the whole lot. And then I mentioned the texts of hymns are as important as the tunes. And as I said last week, we always think of hymns and tunes as one thing. Actually, most hymns are written just the text, and the tunes are attached to them. And there are some hymns, and I think the one I can always think of is Brightest and Best and the Sons of the Morning, which is an Epiphany hymn. I think there are 6 or 7 tunes for that, and they're all fine tunes. And so there are familiar tunes, because that's what you sing in the parish, or the best known one, but there's often other tunes. And I know it can be annoying if you go to another parish and you say, oh, yes, I know that hymn. And then the tune is totally unfamiliar. And you go, oh my God. And it's very interesting coming to this country from Australia, how different the tunes were. Most of the hymns are familiar, but there's a whole American tradition of tunes which I was not familiar. And so I've had to learn and appreciate other tunes. But at first you think, oh, it's the wrong tune. Well, actually there's no such thing as a wrong tune, because there are many tunes. And as I mentioned, of course, seasonal hymns are central to the celebration of major feasts. And of course, you expect during Lent and Advent, again, certain hymns that go with the season. I remember one parishioner at Transfiguration said to me one first Sunday in Lent, when I was there, she said, oh, there are a lot of sad hymns today. I said they were penitential. They were seasonal. And I said, we dropped the Alleluias for Lent. But the music is reflecting the liturgy. The music is reflecting the liturgy, and that's why that's important. That the hymns pick up the penitential nature of the season or the readings or whatever, and they all work together. I mentioned there about service music, meaning the communion, particularly the communion service music. We didn't sing anything today, but I think the choir normally do sing Sanctus and Benedictus and so on and so forth. There's lots of music written for the service. There are more elaborate settings where you've got a proper choir with parts, and there are simple settings. Up the front of the hymnal, there's a whole section on service music, and there's a very fine provision of good congregational settings. So the Episcopal Church provides that very well. It's the only church I know that does. And so there's lots of resource there for singing the service. The question is, what should be said and what should be sung? Well, that's I think often it's lots to do with the context. Is there a choir? Is it a professional choir? Is it a mixture of professional and volunteer? Is it a volunteer choir? Is it a children's choir? It does make a difference. And that what they say, you cut your cloth appropriately. So if you're going to sing elaborate music, you probably need a good choir to lead it or to perform it. My feeling is this parish, which I know reasonably, you have a good choral tradition, is there's some things you can sing as a congregation, and some things you sing just as a choir, some things you sing together. You can also mix and match. I think for great festivals like Christmas and Easter, you expect something special. So choirs often do, an anthem, big anthems, or a more elaborate setting of the communion service. You'd expect that at Christmas or Easter or a festival day. On the average Sunday, you'd probably want more congregational music, so the congregation can join in the Gloria or the Sanctus and Benedictus. And so a bit of variety is very helpful in music. There's different traditions about the creed. I'd always grown up in a tradition where you said the creed. When I came to this country, it was always sung. And there's some wonderful sung settings. I've grown to love them. At Holy Apostles, when I was there, we did the Calvin Hampton setting, which I adore. I shouldn't say that. It's a beautiful setting. Transfiguration would often sing Healy Willow, because it's right one, which is again, it's a fine congregational setting. And there are good plain song settings, and there are some of those in the hymnal. There's different traditions there. In the liturgical movement, we very much sort of, and I was part of it, we put a lot of emphasis on that the creed should be said. But that's, I think the sung creed, if people know it, can be very effective. And the same with the Lord's Prayer. In the liturgical movement, it was very much say the Lord's Prayer. But I've grown to love some of the plain song setting of the Lord's Prayer, which I grew to love at Transfiguration with me. A long tradition there of singing most of the service. And once you get to know it, then you can join in. And so it becomes truly congregational. But I think you need to keep that principle in mind. Is what you're doing encouraging people to join in? And sometimes it's very good if there's parish rehearsals. I know in my sister's parish, I go to a bit when I'm in Australia, the choir director will come out like 10 minutes before the service, or 5 minutes, and run through something. So we're doing there's a newish hymn you might know for the graduate. Let's just run through a verse or two. And so he introduces it. So when you come to the hymn, you know it's going to be new, and you actually concentrate and try and sing it. And it's simple ways of, or you can have quite a big rehearsal for special music. There's ways of helping the music to be truly congregational, to really unite the people of God, which is one of its aims. I mentioned organ and instrumental music. I mean, obviously we've got organ here, and the organ music is an important part of the service, as accompaniment and as solo. As I was saying, the prelude and postlude, and it's nice here you stay seated in the postlude. When I grew up, people used to sort of charge out of the church while the poor organist was playing some elaborate piece. But I think most churches in New York, at least, they're much more polite. They sit and listen and applaud, which I think is nice for the musicians. And it's good to use other instruments. And this again depends on the context. At Transfiguration, we had a very fine oboist who sang in the choir. And every so often, if they're doing Jesus, Joy of Man's Desiring, he'd do the sort of solo bits, and it was beautiful. So if you've got sort of instrumentalists in the congregation, it's good to use them. And particularly for festivals like Christmas and Easter, you have almost an orchestral mass, or have some trumpets, have a bit of a fanfare. I mean, it can be very thrilling. Not every Sunday, but from time to time. So the use of organ and instruments as accompaniment is important. But again, context is important. There's no organ, a good pianist, or I mentioned the nun with the flute. There's other ways of leading music and accompanying music and assist us in our singing, apart from organs and pianos. So that's a little bit a plug for other instruments as well. And then there's the big question, who chooses the music? Well, the rector always gets blamed, and for good reason, because ultimately the canons quite clearly say that the rector has authority over liturgy and worship. That includes music. So strictly, the rector chooses the hymns. I say it's very important that every organist in the land knows that as a basic principle. Not that necessarily the rector will choose the music, because the rector might be tone deaf. And I know a few who are. But in the best of worlds, and certainly what I always try to practice is that you work with the director of music and sit down together and really talk about the music and discuss hymns and the like. And it can be a very creative time. Other parishes have a liturgy or a worship committee, and that assists in the sort of thinking about issues of how we worship and what music we use. And that can be, in a bigger parish, could be a very good way to proceed, to bring people in to the discussions. But ultimately, it's important that the rector knows who's in charge. That's very much the Episcopal system. It's a balance, but the rector ultimately has the authority over liturgy and music, not over finance and properties, or those of you who serve or vestries know full well. Who chooses the music? And then I say the factors that influence choice, I've mentioned context. And I said at the end, one size does not fit all. There's no sort of correct way of using music in worship, but there are a great variety of ways. It often depends on the context and what resources you have, musical resources. And then I say, I've touched on this already, which parts of the liturgy can be sung and when? Well, I mentioned that a bit earlier on. And I finish up by saying liturgical music needs to be appropriate and uplifting, and most of all, well done. It's better less than more if it's done well. And I think every choir would say amen to that. I mean, there's no point in just putting in anthems and hymns for the sake of putting them in. If there are a few well-sung hymns, or one or two very fine anthems. I mean, today it was very interesting. I know that I happen to love Herbert Howells, and that's one of my favourite anthems, Like as the Harp. I've never heard it sung for two voices, but my God, they did a pretty good job. And it sounded like the real thing, and it was really devotional and beautiful. So, you know, the cloth was cut for a particular situation. So,
What exactly is the difference between a hymn and an anthem?
Anthems usually refer to, it is a set of words sung to music, but it's normally for a choir, or I think that's the distinction made.
I see.
A hymn, normally we think of something that we all sing.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
I mean, strictly the Psalms are hymns. That was the Jewish hymn book. But we call them Psalms because they're in the book of Psalms, and we know what that means. But I think strictly, they're all. I think it's what Paul says: sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. You know, they all refer to sort of the same thing, different words. But specifically, we think of an anthem as sung by. I think in the Book of Common Prayers, in choirs and places where they sing, there shall follow the anthem. That's the rubric. So it was assuming that a choir would sing. Do you remember how they spelled choir in the Book of Common Prayer? It's Q-U-I-R-E. That's the old English one. In choirs and places where they sing. So, yeah. There are questions, Elise.
So may I throw COVID into all of this? Even this past week, we were debating among ourselves. You know, right now, as you all saw, we are not allowing congregational singing. And yet there's another Episcopal church down the street that allows congregational singing as long as folks are masked. My understanding is the churches in the Archdiocese, there's been congregational singing has been allowed. And there's still varying opinions and articles, even last week, being published about what is safe, what is not. So how does safety and this new age of anything affect our tradition, our unity in singing?
Oh, it's very fraught. Because I'm attached to St. Thomas Fifth Avenue with a professional choir, men and boys, which is a big investment, by the way. They brought back 6 men on Sunday, and they're going to increase that, I think, before Christmas. But the boys are not coming back till next year. That's state mandated. So the boys are being schooled and taught, and they're singing in their pod. They're in a sort of sealed environment, so they can sing. So they're being trained, but they can't sing in church. So that's an issue. But at the same time, we're reading, and the rector was saying the other day, that some of the big cathedrals in England, the full choirs have gone back. Canterbury Cathedral and Winchester, they're singing. So again, it's a different, I'm not sure about congregational singing, but certainly quite well. They're often big buildings, so I suppose they can spread out, and they're a fair distance from the congregation, so that would help. So it's a very fraught area. At Transfiguration they sing, but you're told to sing quietly, masked, and don't sing loud. That's sort of what I was doing this morning. I was humming. I love the bass part for Immortal Invisible. So, did you hum too? Yes, I hummed along, and I was feeling the words. I found that actually quite helpful personally. So I don't think that's okay. I think to hum.
I read somewhere that humming isn't, but no, it's like every opinion differs.
Well, I just opened my mouth. I didn't open my mouth.
Yeah, but did you close your nose?
Yes, it's the most perhaps testing area that we like to see, and it's very important as part of our tradition. Hymn singing.
So imagine somebody planting a new Episcopal congregation on the Upper East Side next year.
Yes.
What would be the most important musical choices that these church planters might make?
Well, once again, it would be the context. What sort of space you're singing in, how formal or informal it is, what you do in a room with chairs around like that. And I mean, the church planting, you might start with a sort of a room with some chairs in a circle, or what you do there would be different from what you do here or what you do at St. Thomas. So the context would be important. And who's gathering? Are they new Christians, or are they people who know that they know the hymnody? I mean, obviously, you don't throw the church hymnal at people who've never been to church before.
Well, we do all the time.
We do all the time, I know.
Yeah.
But I mean, but how do we introduce people? I mean, if you had an all-new congregation, I might start a bit more simply. But again, I mean, it's the gift of the person to teach good songs. I mean, a good way in. I mean, I was always interested in the Taizé, and I spent quite a bit of time there back in the 70s, and they use the Taizé chants are repetitive phrases, and that's quite a good way of easy to learn, and that's why in sort of charismatic evangelical circles they use a lot of choruses, repeated. So,
we've used a lot of those chants during Holy Week.
Yeah, they can be effective, but they're easy to pick up. And I think if I was planting a church, I won't be at this stage of life, but I can imagine that's what I'd do. But I'd get ways of uniting the group and creating the atmosphere. All those principles still work. It's just what music you choose. And I mean, I'm not going against the hymnal because there's lots of simple, plenty of good stuff in the hymnal. It's how you use the hymnal. I mean, to give people just all the books without much introduction, that would be sort of a death knell, I would think. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Oh, excuse me. Sorry. There you go. Sorry.
A nice tune.
Yeah, because a lot of your remarks were about tradition and what people were comfortable with, and so that's why I was curious about, okay, we're not starting with that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, then you create a tradition, and you're trying to create a tradition. I mean, those who are leading the group, obviously, are introducing people into the liturgy and into ways of doing it, and introducing to the gospel. So you really, but yeah, it's an important challenge because the diocese is very much concerned about doing a bit of church planting. Certainly at St. Peter's Church, they're trying to do something there. I mean, they're building on an existing congregation, but they're expanding it. But I see that money's been cut out of the budget, so I'm not sure we're going to do anything for a while. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I've enjoyed sharing with you, and I look forward to good things at Epiphany. You've got a lot of challenge ahead. Lots of excitement. Look forward to it. I trust. I look forward to worshiping in your new space.
Us too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
So much.